April 16th, 1961, 1:30 p.m., the Virginia countryside. President John F. Kennedy was standing in the library of Glen Ora, his rented weekend retreat. Outside, the spring rain was beginning to fall on the rolling green hills. Inside, the phone was ringing. It was a secure line from Washington. On the other end was McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, and he was holding a message that would decide the fate of 500 men. The invasion force, Brigade 2506, was already at sea, steaming toward the southern coast of Cuba. They were hours away from the landing beaches at the Bay of Pigs. The plan, meticulously crafted by the CIA over nearly a year, called for a D-Day airstrike at dawn to wipe out whatever remained of Fidel Castro's air force. It was the linchpin of the entire operation. Without it, the landing ships were sitting ducks. Bundy explained the situation to the president. The diplomatic fallout from a preliminary airstrike the day before had been catastrophic. At the United Nations, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been caught in a lie he didn't know was a lie, denying American involvement while the world pointed to the evidence. The optics were terrible. The plausible deniability, the mask the U.S. was wearing, was slipping. Kennedy held the receiver, looking out at the rain. He made a decision that defied every military textbook ever written. He ordered the dawn airstrikes to be canceled. "No more planes," he said. "We're not going to escalate." What Kennedy didn't know was that by trying to save face diplomatically, he was condemning the brigade to death militarily. He believed he was choosing a middle path between war and peace. In reality, he was choosing a massacre. The warning from the CIA's military planners had been explicit, written in bold in the operational files. Air superiority is absolute. If the Castro Air Force flies, the invasion fails. Kennedy ignored the warning because he thought he was managing a political problem. He didn't realize he was managing a slaughter. To understand why a war hero and a student of history could make such a fatal error, you have to understand the trap the CIA had built for him. The Bay of Pigs plan was not Kennedy's invention. It was an inheritance. It was the brainchild of Allen Dulles, the legendary CIA director, and Richard Bissell, the architect of the U-2 spy plane program. These were the best and brightest. They were the wizards of the Cold War. Kennedy, the youngest elected president, was awed by their reputation. The plan was seduced by the concept of plausible deniability. The idea was to land a force of Cuban exiles who would trigger a spontaneous uprising against Castro. The United States would provide the logistics, the training, and the money, but no American flag would fly on the beach. If it succeeded, Castro was gone. If it failed, the U.S. could claim it was just a local civil war. But there was a fatal flaw in the logic, a gap that the CIA refused to bridge. The planners assumed that if the invasion ran into trouble, Kennedy would be forced to send in the Marines to save it. They assumed no American president would let an anti-communist force be destroyed on his watch. They were banking on Kennedy's ego. Kennedy, however, was banking on their expertise. He had made it clear, no U.S. combat forces. He viewed the invasion as a covert operation, not a war. The disaster unfolded over 3 critical days, and the one critical warning centered on a specific piece of technology, the T-33 Shooting Star. Day 1, April 15th. The botched opening. The plan called for a surprise airstrike on Castro's airfields on Saturday, April 15th. 8 B-26 bombers, painted with false Cuban markings to look like defectors, took off from Nicaragua. Their mission was to destroy Castro's small air force on the ground. The intelligence reports were confident. They claimed Castro's air force was a joke, a handful of obsolete B-26s and Sea Furies. But the reports missed the critical threat. Castro had 3 Lockheed T-33 jets. These were trainers, but they had been armed with 20mm cannons. A T-33 is a jet. A B-26 is a slow, propeller-driven bomber from World War II. In an air battle, a T-33 would shred a B-26 in seconds. The CIA's own military analysts had warned Bissell, "You must destroy the T-33s on the ground. If even one survives, it can sink the fleet." The April 15th strike was a half measure. Kennedy, worried about the noise of the operation, had limited the number of planes. The bombers hit the airfields, but they missed the T-33s. The jets were hidden under camouflage netting or parked in hangars that weren't targeted. When the smoke cleared, Castro's air force was wounded, but the killers were still alive. The real damage, however, was diplomatic. One of the defecting pilots landed in Miami to sell the cover story, but reporters quickly noticed that the machine guns on the plane's nose had tape over the barrels. They hadn't been fired. The story fell apart in hours. At the UN, Adlai Stevenson showed photos of the plane, unknowingly peddling a lie. When the truth came out, Stevenson was furious. He complained to the White House. Kennedy felt the walls closing in. He felt he was being exposed as a liar on the world stage. He decided to turn down the volume. Day 2, April 16th, the cancellation. This was the day the invasion was lost. The brigade was at sea. The D-Day airstrike was scheduled to launch at dawn on the 17th. To finish the job, the first strike had started. The pilots were in their cockpits in Nicaragua, engines warm, waiting for the go order. This was the moment Kennedy took the call at Glen Ora. He was looking at the political fallout, not the tactical reality. He canceled the strike. The CIA Deputy Director, General Charles Cabell, pleaded with the president's advisors. He explained the math. The brigade's ships, the Houston and the Rio Escondido, were loaded with ammunition and fuel. They were slow, soft targets. Without air cover, they were floating bombs. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, relayed the president's final no. Rusk told the military men that the political risks were too high. He didn't understand that the military risks were absolute. The order went down to Nicaragua. The pilots were told to shut down their engines. Some of them wept. They knew what was waiting for their brothers on the beach. They knew about the T-33s. What Kennedy didn't know, what nobody told him clearly enough in that phone call, was that the invasion plan had no backup for this. The entire operation relied on air superiority. By canceling the strike, Kennedy wasn't just reducing the noise. He was removing the engine from the car while it was driving 100 miles per hour. Day 3, April 17th. The slaughter. Dawn broke over the Bay of Pigs. The brigade began to land. For a few hours it looked like it might work. The men hit the beach securing the perimeter. They were elite, motivated, and well-trained. Then the sun came up, and the sky turned into a graveyard. At 6:30 a.m., a T-33 jet screamed over the beach. It was faster than anything the brigade had. It ignored the men on the sand and went straight for the ships. The Rio Escondido was carrying the brigade's entire supply of communications equipment, aviation fuel, and 10 days' worth of ammunition. The T-33 fired rockets into its deck. The ship didn't just sink, it disintegrated. The explosion was so massive it looked like a tactical nuke. A mushroom cloud rose over the Bay of Pigs. Minutes later, the Houston, carrying the 5th Battalion, was hit. The captain grounded the ship on a reef. The men jumped into the water, strafed by the jets as they tried to swim to shore. On the beach, the brigade commander, Pepe San Roman, grabbed his radio. He called the CIA handlers on the command ship. "We are under attack by enemy air. Where is our air cover? Where are the planes?" The answer was silence. Or rather, the answer was in Washington, where Kennedy was sitting in the cabinet room, reading the reports with a face drained of color. The CIA had assumed Kennedy would panic and send in the U.S. Navy. The aircraft carrier USS Essex was sitting just over the horizon. Its decks were packed with A-4 Skyhawks, painted gray, with American stars on the wings. The pilots were in the cockpits, engines turning, watching the battle unfold. They could hear the screams on the radio. They begged for permission to launch. Kennedy held the line. No U.S. involvement. He allowed a compromise, one of the most tragic half-measures in military history. He authorized the B-26s to fly from Nicaragua to cover the beach, but only for 1 hour, and they were not allowed to attack ground targets. To protect them, he allowed the Navy jets from the Essex to fly cover, but they were ordered not to fire their weapons and to remove their insignia. It was a logistical nightmare. Because of a confusion over time zones, the B-26 bombers arrived an hour early. The Navy jets arrived an hour late. The B-26s were unescorted. Castro's T-33s were waiting. It was a turkey shoot. 4 American pilots, flying for the CIA, were shot down and killed. The brigade on the beach watched their last hope spiral into the sea. By the afternoon of April 19th, it was over. The brigade had fought for 3 days without sleep, without food, and without ammo. They had inflicted massive casualties on Castro's militia, nearly 20-1, but they couldn't fight physics. You cannot win a modern war without the sky. San Roman's last radio message to the CIA was a haunting indictment of the political compromise. I have nothing left to fight with. Am taking to the woods. I can't wait for you. Then, he smashed the radio. The aftermath: 1,189 men were captured. 114 were dead. They were paraded on Cuban television, humiliated. Castro became a global icon of resistance. The United States looked simultaneously like an imperialist aggressor and a weak, incompetent amateur. Kennedy was shattered. In private, he paced the White House gardens, agonizing over the decision. How could I have been so stupid? He asked his brother Bobby. He realized he had been trapped by his own experts. The CIA had presented him with a plan that only worked if he agreed to do the one thing he swore he wouldn't do: invade with the U.S. military. He fired Allen Dulles. He fired Richard Bissell. He vowed to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. But the true cost of the Bay of Pigs wasn't just the humiliation. It was the lesson Moscow learned. Nikita Khrushchev looked at Kennedy and saw a boy who hesitated. He saw a president who would launch an attack, but lacked the stomach to finish it. He concluded that Kennedy could be pushed. This calculation led directly to the Berlin Wall later that year, and to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Khrushchev put nuclear missiles in Cuba because he believed Kennedy was too weak to stop him. He thought the U-2 flights would be ignored, just like the air cover was canceled. The irony was brutal. Kennedy canceled the airstrikes to avoid a noisy confrontation with the Soviet Union. By doing so, he guaranteed the closest the world ever came to nuclear annihilation. The deep dive into the archives reveals that the one critical warning, the threat of the T-33s, wasn't just a footnote. It was the entire ballgame. The CIA knew it. The Pentagon knew it. But they spoke in the language of probability, and Kennedy listened in the language of politics. The final paragraph of the tragedy is written in the ransom notes. Kennedy spent the next year negotiating for the release of the prisoners. The United States paid $53 million in baby food and medicine to Castro to get the men back. The philosophical lesson of the Bay of Pigs is haunting. It teaches that in the exercise of power, there is no middle ground between war and peace. You are either in or you are out. Kennedy tried to be half in. He tried to wage war with the manners of diplomacy. The lesson is that a leader cannot outsource his judgment to experts. The experts looked at the maps and saw logistics. Kennedy looked at the maps and saw headlines. The brigade died in the gap between those two visions. The 3 days in April 1961 proved that the most dangerous course of action is not action or inaction. It is hesitant action. A strike not struck is often worse than no strike at all. Kennedy learned that lesson in the blood of 100 men, and the world nearly burned because of it.